Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Baron of Dice, premium wargaming dice. Over 500 styles, over 4,000 customer reviews. Welcome to the best dice on the planet. Skaventide is finally with us, delivering a whole host of fantastic new sculpts to the Age of Sigmar range. In particular, I'm very interested in the Skaven range, many of which I like to put on square bases for the old world. And while I wait for my Skaven half of the Skaventide box, I thought it would be fun to dig out an eBay rescue that I have, the Skaven Doomwheel. Welcome to Miniature Realms, my name's Stuart, and in this video I'm going to show you how I painted this fantastic machine. Now, my eBay rescue came ready assembled, but luckily with a couple of the parts off, I maybe would have done a few more sub-assemblies. But I also appreciate many people paint their miniatures in this way, so doing a bit of a tutorial showing how I paint things mostly together is probably more relevant to a lot of people. I'm starting here with a bit of an underpaint, so I'm using my airbrush with some white to give a bit of a zenithal pre-highlight to most of the miniature, enabling me to get some base layers down. I'm going to be using a mixture of contrast paints, but also regular paints as well. I'm going to be using the power of those contrast style paints over the detail of the miniature to provide some shadow and some shading and some regular highlights as well. But I'll also be doing lots of very regular techniques, layering and blending and things like that. That all being said, for me and the style I paint with at the moment, I'm using this underpainting method an awful lot, which very often means I'm zenithal highlighting to start with, sometimes adding a bit of a dry brush layer a la slap chop as the latest name it's been given, but it provides a brilliant base from which to work on for your base layers, be that a contrast style paint or regular. Now, I mainly use a contrast style paint in order to base coat my miniatures. I find that it gives me a really nice strong base layer with some highlights and shading built in, of which I can develop upon with regular painting techniques afterwards. I'm starting here with a skin tone with this dwarf skin from Vallejo Express Colour. However, if you're a user of Citadel contrast paints, Gilliman Flesh is probably the closest to this. It's one of the weaker in terms of pigment. I don't want anything too dark, and I'm just slightly tinting the skin areas. And I'm working from inside to out on this miniature. I don't want to work on the outside of the wheel yet, because I'll just rub the paint off while handling it. And I could mount it on something, but this is a perfectly suitable solution to do. So I'm going to start on the inside of the wheel and work my way out. There's not a huge amount of skin showing on these rats, and there's only the two crew members, so I'm just working my way onto the hands of this second crew member. This underpainted method, this pre-highlight, whatever you'd like to call it, just provides a really nice base, so a nice thin layer of this dwarf skin, and the skin is fantastic as it is, but we will be doing lots more to it. Next up, we have Express Colour Deep Purple, which is a sort of a reddish purpley tone. I just used this thin 50-50 on my wet palette, but I'm just adding a little bit of redness to the deep parts on the ears, in between the fingers on the hands, a little bit around the elbow. Just gives it a little bit more depth. This is Cygor Brown contrast paint and Hull Red as a first highlight. And again, I'm continuing to work from the inside out on this miniature so that my fingers don't spoil any of the work I've completed. And he's got this kind of leatherish armour underneath his cloak showing, so that it doesn't take too long to do this. And I'm going to try and whiz through many of the stages of this tutorial, because there's so many things in it. It would easily be an hour long, and I want to keep it down to sort of the 20-25 minute mark. But once that base layer of Cygor Brown is down, we just go in with that Hull Red and just give it a little bit of a highlight, leaving the Cygor Brown showing below. There's already a deeper tone for where the Cygor Brown has run into the recesses, and the black areas from the pre-shade is already done. But this just gives it a little bit of extra lift and a little bit of extra pop. Now, this is German Camo Pale Brown, which I've decided to add an even further highlight, just adding a little edge highlight to the thin areas on the gloves, which I painted in that same sort of red leather method, just picking out the odd little knuckle, the odd little thin line there, and it really makes it pop. Now, there's a little bit of fur showing on the Skaven, and I'm going to be using contrast paint Garagak Sewer for this. It's got a little bit of kind of a long hair showing down from his beard there, at least that's what I think it is. And there's a little bit also around the shoulders and around the elbows on some of the crew as well. And then adding Flat Earth and Tan Earth from Model Colour completes that little triad with the Garagak Sewer. So we're using the Flat Earth first, just giving a nice thin line on each of these strands of hair, leaving all of that Garagak sewer underneath, allowing it to form a part of the shade, along with the shade that's already there, as I keep saying, because of the way we've underpainted the miniature, and that is really important for adding the depth here. And then after that, we move on to the tan earth for the little fine highlights on top, making sure you're leaving a little bit of each layer showing, so your classic layer painting here, but it really adds depth and helps things pop. Staying with contrast paints, this is Basilicanium Grey, and I've decided my crew here will have grey lower halves of their smocks, of their clothing, and I'm going to be using red for the top, but we're working on the grey now. And again, there's not an awful lot showing, so just working my way in, giving a nice level coat, not too thin because you want it to run into those recesses, but not too thick as well because you don't want it to pull. So I'm just moving it around on the miniature, giving a nice thin layer so that the highlight shows up and so that the shade is built in. And as I mentioned, that is the same on both crew members, so I'm doing the same method on the little guy on the back as well. Now we switch to two thin coats. We have Wizard Grey and Carcharodon Grey. Now the Wizard Grey is actually a shade in one of their triads, and the Carcharodon Grey is actually one of their mid-tones. But what we're doing is we're using the Wizard Grey as the first highlight on these robes. I'm just following the lines that are actually there already, left by the way the contrast paint works over the pre-highlight, over the underpainting. So I'm just reinforcing them, making them brighter. It's a fairly neat thin lines. Then after that, I will go back in with the Carcharodon Grey, the lighter grey, and then even smaller, thinner lines just to make it pop. Now for the top part of the smock, and we're starting with Contrast Blood Angels Red, and I love this colour. It's such a rich, beautifully pigmented colour, and it runs lovely over the miniature. It's one of my favourites to paint with, and it's so much fun. If you haven't base coated with contrast paints and you store base coating regularly, do give them a go over this kind of method. It's so easy and smooth to go on. It makes that really boring, laborious stage of base coating slightly less painful, and then you can still highlight in the way you'd always would on top. But continuing just as before, a nice smooth layer, not too thin, not too thick, allowing it to form in all those recesses where the shadow is already built in by that prep we've done, really giving it a nice thin coat on the top so that it doesn't pull, and you've got natural highlights already built in. Returning to two thin coats, and we have Sanguine Scarlet and Demon Red. I'll be using the Sanguine Scarlet first, just the same as we did on the grey, so reinforcing those highlighted areas that are already showing through, following those lines, keeping them relatively neat, before finishing off with that top highlight, slightly thinner lines, leaving the previous layers showing. And I'll keep banging on about it, but it just makes this style of painting so much easier than starting with a regular base coat. You actually get more gradual layers of highlighting because of that contrast method as a base. So this is another one of my regular used little triads. It is Skeleton Horde contrast paint with Iraqi sand and white grey from Model Colour. So what happens is the Skeleton Horde goes thinly over an area that's quite light already, so fairly white in its underpainting. Give it a nice thin layer, letting it flow into the recesses, as we've done with all the previous stages so far. I'm also catching these little spikes that are growing from this Skaven here. But after that, I'm going back in with the Iraqi sand with a thin line, and then just a extra thin line of the grey-white afterwards to really make it pop. It's just a really simple, creamy off-white method. Whether you're playing Age of Sigmar or Warhammer the Old World or anything else with Skaven in for that matter, you may want some Skaven themed dice, and if you do, please do check out the channel sponsor Baron of Dice. They have a wide range of dice, many of them themed to your favourite armies. Check the link in the video description and use Miniature Realms for 5% discount. Continuing to work my way from the inside of the miniature, I'm using some contrast warp lightning here. Now over this white that's already in there, that sort of greyish white from the airbrushing we did, a thin coat of this looks absolutely fantastic and already shows some of the detail. It already starts to pull in the recesses of this nice warpstone here. I'm catching this little pot, this little jar of maybe liquid warpstone or something he's got for a quick swig once in a while to keep his spirits up during the battle. And then what you can do afterwards when it's dry is go back with the same warpstone and just reinforce the shadow with it. Go back into those recesses there. And by doing that, it makes them look darker and it looks like you've highlighted the edges, which is a lot harder to do. Returning to two thin coats, we have Barbarian Brawn, Dwarven Skin and Elven Skin, a nice little triad, one of their skin triads, and probably my favourite and most all-round usable one. I'm actually using a little bit of the Barbarian Brawn in any of the areas I think look a little bit too light. So just towards the top of the hands here by the cuffs, I've just added a little bit of red in, just to add a little bit of depth. But then I'm working my way up through those layers, and I'm really following the Dwarven Skin over the underpainting method we did earlier. So I'm just reinforcing those highlights, so over the tendons on the tops of the hands, across the knuckles and the fingers with the mid-tone, and then coming back in with that Elven Skin as that top highlight, just little dots on the knuckles towards the bottom of the fingers, maybe a thin line on a tendon. It really starts to pop and get that multi-layered flesh approach. Followed the same method on the tail. I'm just picking out those little segmented areas so they really stand out. And now we've picked out most of the smaller bits of inner detail before I need to really attack all the inner metals and the wood. So this is Garrigach Silver, which we've seen already as a base for the fur of the Skaven, but I won't be highlighting it in the underside here. And what I really need to do is a bit of a pain in the bum job now. It's covering all of the wooden areas, which, because it's built in this way, and I don't know how else you'd do it really in sub-assemblies, it would be a pain anyway, get inside and really cover it all. Now if you spray it black and work up from black, that would be one way of adding the shadow in, but I really like the way this contrast basing works. So I'm just taking my time, I put some music on, and I work my way around the inside of these wheels, covering everything pretty much, even the areas that I want to be metallic, because they're going to be coppers and browns, so everything gets covered that's not already been painted in a nice thin coat of Garrigach Silver, including those blasted rats at the bottom. Now I definitely would have left them out to paint separately and glue in afterwards if I had my way, but this is the way it came to me, and I appreciate, as I said earlier, many of you will paint this way anyway. You'll build your miniatures, you'll play your games, and then you'll find ways to paint them afterwards. Now once that's all dry, we can turn to the first metallics of the paint so far, and we have Decayed Metal and Victorian Brass from the Scale and Alchemy range from Scale 75. So we're starting with the darker tone first and just giving a nice thin coat over all the metallic areas. Now because we've got that Garrigach Silver there, it's a brown base, so we can be a little bit lazy with this here, and if the odd little bit gets missed in the recess, it doesn't matter. In fact, it actually adds to the effect. We're going to be using some oil paints later on as well. So I'm not too worried. The main thing I want to do is make sure that I don't get it on any of the areas of the Skaven that I've already finished. I don't want it on that cape, any on that red cowl at the top. I definitely don't want any skin. So I'm just trying to take my time and making sure that I don't mess up really. I'm even using it on the armour of the Skaven, and while I've decided that's not going to be a coppery brassy colour, it's going to be more of an iron colour. It forms a really nice base if you want your iron metallics to look quite old and battered. Now it's to the Victorian brass. I'm doing a lot of overbrushing here. I'm making sure some of that decayed metal is still showing through, especially in the darker areas, but I'm also allowing the Victorian brass to dominate where the light would hit more, basically building up sort of a two-tone metal effect. Now on to the first steel colours, and we have black metal and game air silver. Black metal is a scale colour, metal and alchemy range. Game air silver is from Vallejo, and it's a really nice smooth paint. Even though it's an air paint, it paints very well with the regular brush. In fact, I prefer it because it's got very small metal flakes in it, so it's just a super smooth paint. In fact, all of the Scale 75 metallics are super smooth in that way as well, but we're essentially just building up a layer here and then doing a little bit of a highlight. I'm actually wet blending a little bit between the two colours here. It's such a small area of silver, but it just makes his armour stand out from all the other metal, which is very bronze dominant inside the centre of the wheel. I wanted to give some of that brass effect a little bit of a lift. So this is Dwarf and Gold from the same metal and alchemy range from Scale 75, and this really is a little bit of an overbrush, just where the light would hit the most here and there. But once that's all done, I need to start working on these rats. But first of all, their tails are brown, and I want them to match the tails of their bigger cousins. So I'm actually just going in with a white grey here and giving a quick base colour so that I can use contrast paints on top. Before we do those colours, I need to highlight these rats, and I want to make them a mixture of colours. So I've got a mixture of browns here from Model Colours, whole red and flat earth, mainly chocolate brown, and then like a light orange brown. Many of the mixes you've seen before. on the rats and some others, and the idea is just to take each rat at a time. I've got all these paints on my palette and I'm mixing one with the other, so just building up a couple of layers. They're so small here, it's so hard to film and to show you, and in an ideal world, if you're painting these at home and you're building this yourself, leave this little row of rats out there on each side and paint them separately and stick them in after, because it'll be so much easier. But essentially I'm just using very similar techniques as I did on the fur of the Skaven, those 2 or 3 layers over what is a Garragax sewer base anyway, but by highlighting them with different shades of brown, some with more oranges and things, they just stand out as slightly different coloured rats. Returning to those 2 Vallejo Express colours that we used on the Skaven flesh earlier, and just using the same method as we did onto the tails of these little rats. So the dwarf skin base layer first, some little thin lines of the deep purple just to really pick out those segments on the tails. Then returning with that little elven skin for that top highlight again, just in between those little segments, just adding a few lines to make them pop. Now we have white grey from model colour. I'm going to do a little bit of dry brushing. I'm just going to really pick out some of that wood grain here. So we've got the pre-highlights already done with the airbrush, but to really accentuate some of that detail when you add glazes on top, it's really nice to pick out those sharper edges. So I'm even going just inside the wheel here, just the wooden rim. There's metal there as well, but we'll cover that afterwards. Just making sure I catch that wooden rim, really pick out some of that wood grain, because it will make it so much easier to do the next part. This is why I did the inside first as well, to make sure that I didn't wear any of this off with my fingers when I was painting the inside. Also returning with all dry brush to those little warpstone areas as well, because when we add that green warpstone glow again, it will really accentuate the edges if they're showing out on the miniature. But first off, the wood, and we have Militarum green, we have Garragax sewer again, and we have wildwood, all from Citadel Contrast. Now the core colour will be the Garragax sewer, which is what we put on the inside of the wheel. I'm actually just doing a thin layer around at first, just on that inside bit of wood, and because we've highlighted by dry brushing the inside, it just gives a little bit of a highlight that really makes the edge of the wood stand out. But the most important part is wet blending it all on the outside of the wheel. So we're going with the Garragax sewer, add a little bit of the Militarum green, add a little bit of the wildwood, and sort of mix them in all together. It runs into the recesses, which are accentuated now by dry brushing all the delicate sort of details of the wood. And as you can see, as it's starting to drift in and form into those details, you've got this lovely wooding effect. Once that's all dry, I grab the deck tan, which is a really nice sort of cover-all dry brush paint. I've got hardly any on my brush here. I don't want it to look really chalky and white, but I just want to reinforce some of those wood grain details again. And then afterwards, I'm using Skeleton Horde to gently tint any of that dry brushing I did, so it removes anything that's accidentally chalky. Gently tint it with a lighter colour. This adds another tone to the wood and looks like when the edge of the wood's been worn away, revealing some of the softer stuff underneath. Overall, this wood method is no skill at all. You're just slapping contrast paints. It's all about the prep. It's all about that pre-shade or that pre-highlight with the airbrush over the black, and then that dry brush afterwards. It certainly beats going in and individually highlighting wood grain, and I think it looks fantastic. So it's time to return to those same metallic colours for the brass mix that I used on the inside of the Doomwheel. And I'm using it on the outside, and this is exactly the same method. So we're starting with that decayed metal before we go on to the Victorian brass and then the dwarven gold. Doing a little bit of dry brushing, very light with some of the lighter colours on this. I couldn't get the dry brush on the inside, especially with the Skaven in there. I would have overbrushed onto them. I've not done it with all of it. Some of them I've painted this in, but for other layers, if I want a nice smooth transition between those different brass coloured paints, this is a really good way of doing it. Then returning to the other metal combo, the black metal and the Game Air Silver, I'm going to be using this in a few areas on the outside of the wheel as well. Now I've decided to make all the cables on this a sort of metallic colour. You could go for the cartoon-esque sort of studio style, quite often bright red or bright green cabling. I want something a little bit more grim and dark, and we've got colour on there with the warpstone, and we've got colour on there with the red on the top of their cowls. So I want this to look a little bit more dark and industrial, and because we've already gone copper and brass for the other bits of the metal, I'm switching it up here and going for a sort of steel kind of look. I'm also just painting the edge of the wheel. They've got this sort of little track around the edge which works with the cogs. Decided to make that a metal colour. And just a mix of other details as well. We've got these coil springs sort of suspension, which is on this little back wheel here. And we've also got these big blades at the front. And for the larger areas here, I'm actually using dry brushing again to get a nice smooth blend into that Game Air Silver. And Game Air Silver dry brushes so well. You don't need very much on the brush at all. And you can dry brush over black and it's just brilliant. Now for some washes on the metallics, and this is a ready mixed oil wash, dark mud from Soilworks from scale 75. The ready mixed nature just means it's really, really easy to use. You can obviously mix your own, but if you are new to oil washes, these work very similar to a lot of the streaking grime type products and things that are out there at the moment. The ready mixed ones seem quite friendly to your paints, and they definitely don't strip any paints away. If you're mixing your own and you're using your own thinners and things, they can sometimes strip paints back, so a lot of painters will protect first with a gloss varnish. I use these an awful lot over acrylic paints and have no issues. I tend to use them over metallics first, which are fairly robust in most cases, definitely the metallics I use, and I only want them on the metallics here anyway. Now the joy of these over a standard wash like an Agrax Earthshade, and forgive me if you're a regular viewer and you hear me bang on about this all the time, but the benefits of them is that they don't pull too much on the flat surfaces. They run into all those recess areas. You've got in that pin wash type effect, and when they dry, they look dry, dusty and dirty, but they still shade as well. You can see here they just flow into all the detail and really add lots of a nice effect to these metallic areas. And then the other benefit, which is even better, is using a little bit of white spirit. Now this is artist white spirit. This is quite important. You want to use that or Sansador or a product like that, not your DIY type stuff. That will be far too strong, not just in smell, but also in what it would do to your paint job. Is you can wipe it away afterwards. So I'm using an old brush for both the application and the removal here. I've got a little bit of kitchen roll to the side. I dip my brush in the clean white spirit, and any place where the oil wash has gone on a flat surface, as soon as it's touched dry, you can just wipe it back off again. And even if I left this 24 hours, it takes a long time for oils to fully set, so you can just come back and clean them away. And you can't do this with a standard wash like an Agrax Earthshade. Once it's dry, it's dry. So in order to get that flat colour, what you tend to do is go back in with the mid-tone again or the base layer and build them back up. And it's such a waste of time when you can do it this way around. And the end effect, I believe, is even nicer as well, especially if you like that kind of grim and dirty look, which is absolutely perfect with Skaven. So I'm just working my way around, clearing any of the kind of grimy mud off those flat surfaces where the light would hit. So it really makes it pop and shine again, but you're also leaving all that grime in the recesses. And once it's really dry after 24 hours or so, you can see the effect built in. It just looks so realistic and so good. So it's nearly the end of my pitch for oil paints, but just give them a go, or any of the streaking grimes, any of the things that work in this way. They aren't as hard as people think they are. They're not just for military modelers. They are great things to have a go at, and the effects are brilliant. So while I'm waiting for those oils to fully set and dry out in the sun in the garden, I thought I'd work on the banner for the top. I've already painted the banner using the same red and off-white methods earlier. And I'm just adding some little dots here. And it's a nice way of working out where this freehand design is going to go. So it's almost like joining the dots dot to dot, and with it being Skaven, it can be a little bit scruffy and messy anyway, but I think you can find you can do the most simple designs without too much effort. So I'm just filling in the gaps now once I've drawn those thin lines between the dots that I've already placed. As I move on to the sort of second shape, you start to see it come together. Now, this is a very simple design. Some things more complex require very, very different skills, and I'm not the best at freehand. But for Skaven, this is perfect, and you'll see it starts to come together. To move on to that final layer, and I can always touch this up afterwards with a little bit of red paint if I need to, and I'm going to weather the banner as well, so it's going to have lots of mud and probably some blood on it later on. Now that those oils are dry, I just want to give the edges a little bit of a worn look. So I'm returning to that Game Air Silver. Hardly any on my dry brush here. And I'm being very, very gentle, working in one direction at the moment. I'm certain that there's not too much coming off. I'm really just working on the edges where the constant use and touch will change the edge of that brass metallic to a different colour. Just catching the edge of the bolts and things as well. So it really picks out that detail, helps it pop. But you don't want to go too thick, so you don't want to turn it to a silvery looking colour. You really are wanting to grab just those edges. We're getting close to the end now, and we're returning to that warp lightning contrast paint and working in the same way as we did internally on the outside parts of this warpstone here. I'm also adding a little bit of it slightly thinned just to the inside and around the edges of the metallic areas where the warpstone is there, just adding a little bit of glow, quite subtle. And then using a little bit of the ethereal green from Two Thin Coats just to add a little bit of a highlight to this lightning pattern at the back. Very much in final touch stages now, but this is Rust from Dirty Down. You'll have seen this lots. It's really become popular over the last couple of years. I first used this more than a decade ago, I think, and it was good back then. It was quite hard to get hold of, and I know it's been relaunched now. It's a lot more expensive now, but it is really good stuff and it goes a long way. And there's lots of ways you can use it. I'm using it here to first of all just put a few thin streaks of rust where something has become rusty and moisture's got into it and it's run down. But you can almost like dry brush it or stipple it in as well. What I like to do is add a little bit of water to it and feather it out first for a nice thin layer, and then go back in with it a little bit thicker and stipple it on. Also adding a little bit of blood for the blood god to the edges of the blades, and a couple of splashes in other places as well. And a few splots of European mud effect as well, everywhere, all over, mostly on the wheels, but where it may have splashed up as it sped along. I've had so much fun painting this. It's the first one I've ever done. In fact, I've never had a Skaven army in either game system before. And the release of the new stuff and a few other activities I'm doing on the channel around Skaven Slayer and Warhammer Quest and Gotrek and Felix meant that it's finally time for me to start collecting some Skaven. So there will be a few more videos on the channel related to Skaven. There's already a couple of tutorials on there already. I will pop links to those in the video description or up in the corner of the screen now, so do look out for those. You'll find most of the tutorials, the miniatures, end up on square bases. That's because I'll be using them for Warhammer, the Old World, and the first Legacy army that I'll be covering in more detail on the channel. But whether you're a Age of Sigmar player or a Warhammer, the Old World player, regardless of the base shape, I'm pretty sure to be able to take many of the tips and tricks and things that I do, if you like them that is, and take them over to your own painting. So let me know what you think of the paint job. Are you picking up Skaventide? Are you using it for the Old World or using it for Age of Sigmar? What do you think of the new models? Love to hear people's thoughts in the comments below. If you are new to the channel, please do check out the other videos. Loads and loads of painting tutorials across a wide number of games. Lots of Old World stuff, which is also useful for Age of Sigmar as well. If you've enjoyed the video, give us a like, give it a share, subscribe if you haven't already. All of those things that really help. Join the channel's Discord. There's a link in the video description. It's a nice friendly place to go and chat about anything wargaming there. And if you'd like to support the channel further, I also have a Patreon, which is a really great way of helping the channel, helping me keep the lights on, so to speak. But thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.